Cornish Mutual, farming insurance experts.
Hello and welcome to this bonus episode of Farming Focus, the podcast for Southwest farmers brought to you by Cornish Mutual. I'm your host, Peter Green. In our main episode last week, we explored the growing interest in regenerative agriculture. But beyond the environmental benefits, does regenerative farming make business sense? In this short bonus conversation, I'm joined again by Tim Williams and Louise Penn to talk about the economics of regen, from managing inputs and yields to long-term business resilience. We'll start with you, Louise. There's a perception that regen farming costs more or delivers less, but where do you stand on that?
So, for example, my family farm, we used to be very conventional, and we now farm more regeneratively. And I don't think that we're making more or less money than we were. There's definitely bits where we've saved money from changing our system, but we've also had to invest money from changing our system. And a big investment is time. You know, the amount of time that we have spent learning about what we're doing, it's a completely new way of farming, is massive. But, you know, people say that there is sometimes a dip in yields initially, but you know, if you set it up right and have a slow progression, you can really limit that. But actually, I think it's about looking at your costs, putting together budgets, and actually, what I see where I'm doing that with clients is that it's not really neither here nor there. We're spending less on inputs. We've got better attention to detail. Our soils are working better, functioning better. So, I think that, you know, it doesn't necessarily cost any more, it doesn't necessarily cost any less, but I think that you are improving your system, and it's more about kind of the long-term game rather than the short-term one.
So, Tim, you work and have worked with many farmers in this space. What have you seen in terms of where the biggest potential savings can be when transitioning from a conventional system to regenerative systems?
Well, I guess, again, it's that sort of long-term mindset. And the challenge, I guess, is understanding the asset value of your soil, of your land, and looking after that. And how can you monetize that is the real challenge, because if, you know, and it shouldn't cost more, because essentially, like if you listen to people like Gabe Brown, the reason why he went down this route is the only thing when everything, he had nothing left in the tank, essentially. The only thing he could work on was soil, because soil health was what he personally could work on without it costing him anything. So understanding that you're in it for the long-term gain, understanding that your soil, particularly if you're a landowner, is that this is your greatest asset. And so you are working on banking that and improving that asset. But essentially, if you do your homework, yes, in terms of learning, but there's so much information out there now compared to when I started this journey, that the amount of information is caught up rapidly. And, you know, even just listening to a John Kemp podcast while you're driving your tractor instead of Radio 2, you know, those sorts of things will bring you on. But a true regenerative system should definitely not cost you more. And actually, if you understand your context and understand the system that you're working with, if you really get the true regenerative process, is actually zooming out and creating an efficient, economically resilient system as well as a resilient soil system. So you want to, and that's where kind of my learnings came from, coming from New Zealand, working in the dairy industry in New Zealand. It's all grass-fed. It's all about efficiencies. You know, New Zealand is one of the most efficient producers of milk in the world. And that is through, and meat as well, is understanding those efficiencies and creating these efficient systems. And that's all about that whole system approach.
So I appreciate we're not going to do this justice in a bonus podcast episode, but when we talk about this holistic systems approach, because there'll be people listening sort of that are asking, well, what does that actually mean? Is it a case of, so I guess the first meeting that you would have with a farmer once you've established that they do want to go down the regenerative route and why that might be, what would you actually be looking at? Would you be looking at, right, you're a dairy system, you're currently feeding X tons of cereals to get milk from the cows. You want to move away from that. What are you actually looking at when you talk about a systems approach?
So the first thing I'd start with is objectives. What are your objectives? 10 years down the track, what do you want to achieve? Where do you want to be heading? And then we start to work back in terms of how do you get there? Do you want to create a more resilient system? Are you working with the right genetics? Do you have the right genetics? I've been into a dairy system where they want to go regen, and they've got a couple of thousand massive Holstein cows milking 3 times a day, feeding them on maize. And it's like, okay, well, how do we get to that point? Because your system it's expensive. You need to start looking at that. Zoom out, okay, we can focus on the soil, but actually, should we be growing maize in this situation? Are there alternatives? Can we change the breeding over the next 10 years to bring a more resilient animal into the system? What are those outcomes that we want to achieve? We can look at it from stocking densities. Are there marginal animals that we should be getting rid of? Look at the time spent milking those marginal animals, those additional costs, and actually look at that business model across the farm. And is it working? Where's the leaks? Where's the cost? And I guess that is that true essence of moving to that more productive, healthier, financially, environmentally, and soil health, system health, basically.
And potentially, hopefully, a healthier balance for the farmer that we talk about so often on Farming Focus. Louise, my next question was going to be, how important is a plan? But I think actually that Tim has talked about it. So I guess I'll tweak that question ever so slightly and ask you, in your experience with your clients, how important is it to make sure that we are putting time and effort and numbers, financials, into a plan before we just make a change? Because I guess a lot of people just jump and make a change perhaps before they've actually thought through the impact of that, and as Tim's just talked about, where they want to get to medium to long term.
Yeah, I think it's very, and I'm guilty of this, with the family farm, getting excited, once you get into regenerative agriculture. And it's really nice, actually. I've got a farmer who's farmed conventionally for a long time, and probably partly his fault through hiring me as his agronomist. I've got him interested in regenerative agriculture, and he said, for once, I'm actually really interested in farming again. He was like, I've done the same thing for so many years, conventionally farming, and now we're talking about all these different things and doing trials and whatever. But anyway, I diverge. You can get very excited. I'm a bit like my dad. I have big ideas. I want to implement them. But, comes back to the base of this conversation. Profitability and having a profitable farm business is what is going to make you able to farm from one year to the next year and then pass it down to the next generation, which ultimately, as farmers, that's what we want to do. So I think that, big ideas is great. And actually, it's the big idea farmers that are probably the most successful farmers that I come across and clients that I work with. But they have a big idea and then they sit down, and whether that's just, back of an envelope, just seeing whether it makes sense, whether it's that or whether it's actually sitting down with your advisor or I've got clients with Excel spreadsheets. It doesn't matter what you do, but you need to think, is this, what is my return in investment on making this decision? We don't have, unfortunately, the safety net of BPS. We've got too much uncertainty, too many risks. If we're doing something, we need to be able to see that it's going to lead to a more profitable farm business. And figures, finance, also getting everyone involved. I think that's a massive part. It's, if you're doing it for the next generation, bring the next generation along with you. It's got to be something that they want to do if you're implementing something new.
There's so much in there. Tim, you were nodding furiously, particularly when Louise was talking about getting excited and getting interested. I guess first question, is that something which you see when you make these changes, have these conversations with farmers in your business?
Yeah, exactly. I think it's moving, it's notching it up a gear because it is fun. It's fun. And you're out there, you're being observant. So, farmers are amazing at this sort of multifaceted approach to a job. Like there's so much going on, and being observant and going out there where you can see that positive shift in the system, like, going out and even just like seeing the system change, seeing the plants thrive, seeing the animals thrive. People get up, they're excited, they want to go and see what's happening, they dig holes, they're smelling the earth, in these sort of regenerative systems where you are seeing those improvements year after year. And then it's almost like there's a competition in terms of who can do the next fun thing. I've got people who are playing around with foliars and plant extracts and composts and all sorts of things, which would have been unheard of 5 years ago. But now they're like, oh yeah, I tried this foliar out, I got this, my bricks went up. They're out there with refractometers checking the brixing on their plants, and comparing notes with people, and people are enthused to. Yeah, there's definitely a buzz.
So what I'm hearing is there can definitely be a financial resilience improvement to this. It needs planning, but as well as that, it can reintroduce some passion from farmers into what they're doing again, which is fantastic. So, final question for both of you: one tip, a piece of advice for farmers that are considering making this switch, but are perhaps nervous about the financial risk. What would you say to them, Louise? You first.
There doesn't have to be a financial risk. My dad was ploughing. He ploughed every year. We just talked about it. We borrowed a neighbour's drill. They love their shiny new drill so much. They came, we did some direct drilling, we dug some holes. Yes, there's time, investment in time and learning about this thing, but you can dip your toe in. There's so much information out there, farm walks, farm group, books. Have a go, learn about it, and just you'll go down the rabbit hole like me and you'll never look back.
Fabulous. And Tim, one bit of advice for you for that nervous farmer who's wondering about whether or not to take the leap?
Yeah, just try it incrementally, just even if it's just an acre, half an acre, just trial something, put in a cover crop one year, or, just these sort of incremental shifts. If you're dubious of it, try it yourself, but also get good advice or at least research it so that, if you're going to put in a herbal lay, for example, do your homework so you're not spending loads of money on seed and then it fails. Because, that's the worst thing that could happen, because there's so much information, there's so much advice around, and a lot of that information is actually free as well. And talk to other farmers who are already engaged in that process.
Brilliant. Louise, Tim, thank you so much for all of your thoughts and today's conversation. The information that these guys have talked about is freely available all across the web, but you can follow both of them on Instagram. Tim's at earth_farmer. Louise is Louise Penn agronomy _, and you can have a look at what they're doing and find out more there. Thank you ever so much for listening to the Farming Focus podcast.
Cornish Mutual, farming insurance experts.
Thanks for listening to this bonus episode of Farming Focus. If you haven't already, make sure that you subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts so that you don't miss any episodes in the series.